Hello, welcome to another episode of Eagle Productions Respect. We are so excited for today's episode, and for the first time in this company's history, we have a guest. And quite frankly, there's no other guest that we could have, no mortal guest, that'll be better than this gentleman. As an introduction for him, last year was very difficult for me, and he was one of the friends that stood by me and helped me through it. I am very grateful, I'm honored to be his friend. This is Kirk.
Oh, Derek. You're too kind. You talked me up a bit too much, but I'm happy to be here on your podcast and looking forward to our discussion.
That's wonderful. We're looking forward to it. It's going to be awesome. There are new events happening in Korea, and this is going to be very, very important to talk about, particularly with national security issues. And we have an expert on this, and so we're going to do a deep dive into it.
Again, you're too kind. I know a bit, but yeah, there's been some developments that have been happening in Korea over the last few months. Really, to explain it, we have to go back a bit further. So, the previous Korean president, that's an important detail, previous, that's going to become relevant very soon. But the previous Korean president was President Yoon. And President Yoon was the representative of the People Power Party in Korea, which is the Korean Conservative Party. Basically, think of them like Republicans. And he was a former prosecutor. He'd been a prosecutor for about 27 years, not a politician, but he stepped into the political realm because he felt that Korea was going in a wrong direction, particularly with the president before him, President Moon, who had taken a lot of soft stances towards North Korea. That was one of the things President Yoon ran on after President Moon. I know Moon, Yoon, sounds a little similar, bear with me. But President Yoon, he had a couple of platforms. One was a hard stance on North Korea, specifically communism in general. And then the other one that he was big on was reducing corruption in the government. He alleged that there was a great deal of corruption, and then he promised to deal with said corruption. Think of it kind of like President Trump, drain the swamp. Y'all remember that from the first run? Very similar idea. So President Yoon did win election, but it was a very thin margin, like 1 or 2%. Don't quote me on that, but around there. I'd have to check the exact numbers, but very, very slim margin. And the opposition party, which oddly enough is just the Democratic Party. I think it's funny that the Liberal Party in Korea is also just the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party, while he had gotten the presidency, they had a majority in the legislature. So throughout his presidency, he was stymied repeatedly by the opposition party. They were impeaching his ministers and prosecutors, so he tries to appoint people to look into corruption. They would impeach them. He tries to set the national budget. They veto it. They would pass bills that would then get to him that he had no intention of passing. He has to veto a lot of the legislation they were trying to ram through. It was a very adversarial relationship where he was not able to really achieve any of his goals going in due to the opposition from the Democratic Party over there in Korea. So, and you can kind of think of it a little similar, again, similar story. I'm going to draw some parallels, but again, kind of similar to what happened in the United States. We have, President Trump, he gets elected, and there's a concerted effort to oppose his policies, oppose his presidency by the political opposition. Fair, happens. Similar thing over in Korea. So this last December, in December of 2024, President Yoon, this was a crazy thing when it happened, because it happened like late at night on, I want to say it was Tuesday? It was like middle of the week, late at night. He gets up in front of a teleprompter and he declares martial law. Yeah, he goes in front of the teleprompter and he states that the opposition party was conducting anti-state operations, were sympathetic to North Korea, that they had essentially engaged in rebellion by legislature, and that the only way to save the country was to declare martial law. So, yeah.
So, and just for the audience knowing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that martial law means that the government suspends habeas corpus, which means that as a person's apprehended by law enforcement, which is the executive branch of government, and that person's taken in the United States, if somebody is apprehended and say they're accused of a crime, habeas corpus means that the executive branch has to say in front of a judge why they should detain that individual, and part of the arraignment, say you're being accused and charged with this, and that opens the door for due process. But with declaring martial law, they suspend that, so people can just be taken, and the executive branch does not have to have a reason for it. Is that correct?
I'm not certain if Korea has exactly the same statutes around martial law, but I do know that he brought troops into the legislative offices. So there were troops in Seoul. We've got like video of Korean troops blockading entrances to the legislature, protests. It's a surprisingly tame video, I'm not gonna lie. There wasn't like a whole lot of will behind it, either from the troops or even his own party, which again, he was impeached very, very quickly after he declared martial law. He was out very, very quickly. So President Yoon declares martial law, is impeached, and then after he's impeached, we have President Yi, who is the new president-elect, member of the Democratic Party in Korea. So he gets elected. And after he's been elected, there have been some further developments which are also concerning. The biggest one, in my opinion, the one that really worries me, is they passed legislation to increase the number of members in the Korean Supreme Court. So the Korean Supreme Court had 14 members, count them, 14, and they passed legislation to increase that number by 4 every year until they hit 30. So we're looking at a doubling of the Supreme Court in Korea. I don't think anyone can argue that isn't court packing, which, if you're not familiar with the term court packing, essentially that is increasing the number of representatives in a court body in order to change its composition so that it is more in line with your desires. The term court packing actually originated here in the United States. It was 1937. Roosevelt was angry because the Supreme Court had overturned several of the New Deal projects that he wanted. So he proposed legislation to increase the number of members in the court so that he would have a court that would not strike down the New Deal that he wanted. That absolutely got tossed out. No one wanted him to pack the court, wasn't allowed. Although it is interesting, after that, even though the proposal was struck down, the court then did go on to approve the New Deal projects. So they talk about, the switch in time that saved 9 was the phrase. But basically, it's interesting. He didn't get the new judges he wanted, but the threat still managed to make the judges change their opinion, or at least that's kind of what it looks like. But anyway.
Well, I say a really cool historical fact. Now, my understanding is, I could be wrong on this, but if I remember right, former U.S. President William Howard Taft was the Chief Justice ruling over that time. I could be wrong, but if that is correct, that's a really cool historical fact. If it's wrong, just ignore that part of the podcast.
Yeah, give us some grace here. But yeah, so the fact that the Democratic Party in Korea has seen fit to pack the court, I think is very concerning. Historically, court packing tends to be one of the signs that a democracy is failing. In a lot of cases, if you pack the court, that branch is no longer necessarily trustworthy.
That's what happened in Poland recently. There's issues with the judicial system in Poland, if I understand correctly. So yeah, very much so.
So with that happening, just sends very concerning message. I mean, the fact that they had the martial law being declared itself was also very concerning. Like, martial law doesn't tend to be declared over political opposition in healthy democratic systems.
Yeah,
you know?
no, it does not.
So you had the People's Party president, the conservative president, who felt that the divide was so extreme and it was bad enough that he considered his opposition to truly be enemies of the people of the country, and he felt he had to declare martial law. Now, whether he was right to do that, that's a different discussion. Personally, I think it was a vast miscalculation on his part. Like, he made a terrible error. What information he had leading up to that, we can get into that later, but regardless of whether or not he was right and they did have North Korean sympathies and they were corrupt, that was an overreach which damaged faith in him and also just faith in democratic institutions in the country, I think. It's very concerning that he felt that necessary, that it wasn't able to be talked out. And then to see this in response where they're now saying, okay, we're going to seize absolute control of the judicial system for our party. Like, that is also, again, not something that is good for democracy, because that leaves anyone in the People's Power Party saying, okay, well, great, now we can't trust the courts. That's an entire branch of the government that is just lost to us. And that's the sort of thing that leads to extreme action, frankly. Like, if you don't believe you can talk your way out of it,
Yeah.
what's the next recourse?
Yeah, physical violence. And yeah, that's extremely concerning. And it's critical because what's happening in Korea has a direct effect on the national security of the United States.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. So we've been in Korea a very long time, since the Korean War. And we have a number of bases in Korea which are very important to our ability to project power in the region. If you think about the location of Korea, it's very strategic, because you have China and then you have the Korean Peninsula up slightly north into the east. So it's very well positioned between both China and Japan, and also well positioned relative to Taiwan. So we do have bases in Taiwan, we do have bases in Japan, but having those bases in Korea, it gives us a good position both to defend Japan and to defend Taiwan, and of course to defend Korea itself. So there is concern that if Korea destabilizes, that could impact our presence in the region. There's also the fact that, obviously President Yoon claimed the Democratic Party in Korea had sympathies towards North Korea and China. Whether or not that's true, I can't say for certain. What I can say with absolute certainty is that they did send delegations to China to normalize relations, specifically citing that relations had broken down during Yoon's presidency and that they wanted to improve them, and that they felt it was very important to normalize relations with China, which honestly is not unreasonable. I mean, they are a neighbor to China. China is a massive power in the region, both economically and militarily. So I can understand why they wouldn't want to be on the outs with China. But from an American perspective, it is a bit concerning. China is not necessarily a direct rival currently, but there's a lot of reason to believe that they could become more belligerent with the United States. I mean, we are currently engaged in a trade war. That's happening right now.
Yep.
And there's also, our competing interests over Taiwan. China still claims Taiwan. We support the independence of Taiwan. It's why it's still independent, is because we've backed it up. So there's always the discussion of, will China make a play for Taiwan? that was talked about a lot, especially after Russia went into Ukraine, and we saw the response there. There was a lot of dialogue over whether or not China would take this opportunity to try and move for Taiwan. They haven't, obviously, but it was a very real concern at the time, and I think it remains a real concern going forward in the future. And if, again, not saying this is going to happen, but there is concern, certainly, by certain political actors inside of Korea and some people in the U.S. who are watching the situation, that if Korea were to shift away from the United States, it would really diminish our security in the Far East, to diminish the security of Taiwan, diminish the security of Japan, just in general our ability to project power into the region, which would be a very big problem because we have long-standing obligations in Taiwan and in Japan. We would potentially have to think whether or not are we going to uphold these obligations or not. It's a concerning thing.
Very much so, absolutely. Basically, would it be accurate is if Korea destabilizes, the threat concerning the United States on national security front is China invading Taiwan? Would it be accurate to say that's the simple biggest problem of the issue of the whole region?
I'd say that's probably the most prescient concern, right? If Korea destabilizes, or heaven forbid were to align itself with China, Taiwan would be the immediate concern and the most likely flashpoint. How much further China would go past that, how successful they would be, it's very hard to say. Obviously, Taiwan is a pretty significant target, not just for the more cultural and historic reasons where China still maintains their claim on that, but also because it is a major developer for microchips, which very important technology. We're starting to get that over here in the United States, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
When I say starting, the deals have been brokered and there's investment that's going to come in. I don't think there's been any actual development yet. It's going to take some time. But at the very least, we're moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
But Taiwan is critical for the development of chips, which we use in all manner of military equipment. So it is both a cultural and historically significant target for China, but also militarily and economically. Like if they can seize the production facilities in Taiwan, that will go a long way for them. I mean, they already have a lot of economic advantages that they can use, like rare earth metals. China's the major producer. That's how they're currently trying to fight back with Trump's tariffs, is they're hitting us by saying, okay, well, we're going to use our control of the rare earth metal supply to hit you back in the trade war. At least that's my understanding. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right. So it's just, if they already had the rare earth metals and then they get the chips, it's just not a good situation for us. There's also pharmaceuticals. A lot of those aren't produced in the United States either. A good chunk of those do come from China. So that's just, we have way too much of our production in China, frankly. From a national security standpoint, let's ignore economics. And I think there's a strong economic argument that we'd be better off if we produced more. But just from a national security standpoint, if you have the rare earth metals you need to develop your weapons technology are not coming from your own country, they're in fact coming from a potential enemy, that's a concern. If the drugs your population needs are coming from a potential enemy, that's a concern. You know, I mean, if China cuts us off, we are in a bad way.
And if China cuts us off, like you said, we're in a bad way. And in the region, having bases and a military presence in Korea, because of the geography, that's vital. And that helps us also, because my understanding, if we're in, say hypothetically, hopefully it doesn't happen, but hypothetically China invades Taiwan, Korea is the only place that can reach missiles, 'cause I don't believe Japan we can reach missiles. Well, ICBMs can reach it, but strategically, we're in a much better position to militarily plus naval bases to store up supplies and things like that, having Korea in the region as opposed to the other countries nearby.
It's certainly much closer and be a very logical point to, it'd be a logical point to conduct operations from Korea. Like, it's a logical place to do that from, just geographically. Also, there's just having the area, like, what if we lost it, could we hold Taiwan? Maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't project strength if we lose that regional partner.
Yeah.
So what's going on in Korea, very concerning, just from a geopolitical standpoint, but also I think what's going on in Korea, it kind of gives us a lens into what's happening in our own country. I think there's certainly similarities, you know. I drew a couple parallels between President Yoon and Trump earlier, and if you think about it, like, politically divided, very strong political divide. You have president comes in and is promising, you know, reform, and then faces a lot of opposition from the other party. And in President Yoon's case, he overstepped, right? And I think there's a lot of concern, you know, we have with the administration currently. President Trump is trying to advance, you know, the agenda that he promised to the American people. He's got ICE working to deport illegals. He is trying to bring law and order to cities that are having, let's be frank, way too many murders.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely.
When you know for a fact there will be bodies dropping every weekend in the city, that's a problem. And like Chicago, for instance, that's just fact. Bodies drop every weekend.
It is.
So, you know, President Trump is trying to enact those mandates from the people who voted in office, populace, but he's facing significant opposition in doing so, right? From the Democratic Party, Democratic mayors, governors, where they're throwing up, you know, legal obstructions and using some very strong rhetoric. I'll be politic. They're using very strong rhetoric, and you know, already you have bringing in the National Guard in D.C., you have the movement of ICE, you have attempts to bring in National Guard in other cities, and there is that concern, like, thus far, President Trump has acted entirely within the bounds of the law, to my understanding, despite what people may say, and you know, thus far it hasn't pushed the American population so far that he's lost his support. His support is still holding fairly strong. But I do think, you know, there's, looking at Korea, you can see the kind of the parallels, and I worry about making sure we don't overstep here and give opportunity for retaliation and backlash. Because I mean, I don't think you can call what the Democratic Party in Korea is currently doing anything other than retaliation and backlash. I mean, packing the court, but also another interesting tidbit, they've been arresting pastors.
That's very concerning. But for just reason or just arbitrary?
So there's one in particular, Pastor Sun, and he leads a very large church, Korean mega church. I want to say it's Segido, something like that. But he's been very vocal, and vocal in advocating what he calls, what he would term as biblical policy, right? So, for instance, in Korea they had what was called the anti-discrimination law, which was coming out, and it was essentially LGBT legislation for Korea. So kind of similar to like trans and kids bathrooms over here, you know, that sort of thing, where he was very outspoken against that law, and in general he advocated very strongly that people needed to elect leaders who would uphold Christian and biblical values. Like he was outspoken over the pulpit, and his preaching is all, he records it all, you can find it online. But they arrested him because they claimed that he was campaigning on behalf of the People's Power Party, which in Korean law there is a statute which does prohibit campaigning inside of religious organizations.
Okay.
One thing though, while this statute has been around a long time, it's never actually been punished with jail time. They have had pastors in the past who have been convicted of violating the statute. They've never faced anything worse than fines.
Okay.
So this is definitely an escalation there. And then whether or not he didn't necessarily endorse specific, we went off the gold standard, right? Economically, we needed to do it. But that caused a lot of concern internationally, because at the time, we produced everything. Like Made in America, that's why there's that idea of Made in America.
Yeah.
Was like 50s, 60s, a little bit into the 70s. If it was made in America, it was quality, and we produced a lot, and we exported a lot.
Yeah.
Right? But when we went off the gold standard, one of the ways that we assured the world was we said, okay, what we're going to do is we will become consumers of your goods. We will start setting up production in your countries, and then we will be consumers of your goods.
Okay.
And that's one of the ways we alleviated concern of us going off of the gold standard. I want to say it was Nixon. Don't quote me on that. I'm trying to remember. It's been a little bit since I read about all of this. But that's really when you start seeing, like after we go off the gold standard, you start seeing like all the offshoring.
Okay.
And the development of like the global economy more into what it is now, right? And I do think that was a mistake. I think we needed to get off the gold standard. That's no lie. As much as I would like it to be backed by something, so we can't just print ridiculous amounts of dollars. But I do think offshoring to the extent that we did was a mistake. Just because, one, not having production is a problem. Like you said, if the supply chain is interrupted, especially if that's a supply chain for something critical, you know, medicine.
Bullets for military equipment.
Military equipment. And we can make bullets. It's the
Yeah.
chips that are the problem.
That's true, chips for
Like,
technology.
We have a lot of demand for very cutting edge technology in our military, and like downstream that supply line, that's not all produced in the US. The materials are not all gathered in the US. Like that's a problem from a national security perspective.
Chips
But-
in Taiwan.
Yeah, chips from Taiwan, or rare earth metals from China. Which is nuts because we have fantastic rare earth metal deposits in the United States. We just need to develop them.
Yep.
And we're starting to, so that's good. And also, to be frank, for those of you who are concerned about the environment, we'll do it cleaner than China.
Because China doesn't have the same environmental laws that we have in the United States.
So, it's a win-win to do the rare earth metals here. But it's also just, you talk about like, you know, our economy is flagging. We don't produce goods, you know? And that historically has been a very important part of a good economy, is the production of goods. Now, we offer services, we do banking, but it's not quite the same, you know? And there's also large swaths of America which were industrial centers, which were gutted by jobs getting shipped overseas that are now economically in a very bad place. You know, you talk about the Rust Belt.
Oh, great.
It's the Rust Belt now because we stopped making things. Factories went under. Less money into the area.
City of Detroit.
City of Detroit. You know, like it's undeniably you get cheaper goods. You can argue we get goods of worse quality. And you certainly lose a lot of American jobs, which means while we may have cheaper goods, I'd argue we have less purchasing power.
Yeah.
You know? And does the lower cost of the goods offset the decrease in purchasing power? Hard to say. You know, I feel like if you had more production in the United States, you have people in the United States getting paid good wages, they can then turn around and spend that money, and you know, they'd be able to afford slightly more expensive goods. It seems to me that would be a much better model for the American people.
Yeah, and for example, like, say, instead of NAFTA, which my understanding is the North American free trade agreement between Canada and Mexico and the United States. And free trade means there aren't taxes, so it's just free.
Oh, that's not true at all.
Oh, it isn't? Okay, I could be wrong.
Here's the thing. We don't necessarily tax. They trade to us.
But they tax us.
Oh, yeah. For instance, Canada has something like a 300% import tax on milk.
300%?
Yeah. Well, it's necessary because their dairy industry can't compete with ours. Period, end statement. Like, no questions asked. We have individual states that produce more than the entirety of Canada for dairy.
Wow, makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the dairy industry in the United States is another very interesting thing. Have you heard of the cheese case?
I haven't. I used to work at a dairy farm. This is my industry.
Yeah. We can get back to that in a second. But anyway, the point being, like, there are protectionist tariffs and measures imposed against us by Canada and Mexico.
Wow.
Like the dairy one is one I know off the top of my head because I just think that's a funny statistic, 300%. At least it was. I don't know if they've dropped it. President Trump has been going back and forth to Canada for a while now.
That's awesome.
But I remember at one point that was just the factual statistic. Because yeah, they wouldn't have a domestic dairy industry if they had to compete with us. They couldn't. And milk is very expensive in Canada. My roommate lived in Canada, and like it was like $5 or $6 for like a little bag of milk.
Wow.
Like it's very expensive compared to what we have here. So like Canadians could have much cheaper milk if there was free trade, but there's not. And that's kind of the thing, is like in general, free trade has meant we let everyone come to us, but a lot of countries block us out.
Wow, like Canada and Mexico.
Like Canada, Mexico, or Japan with automotive. Like when Trump said, you know, when's the last time you saw was it a Ford or a Chevrolet in Tokyo? Some American car brand. But he was making a point, because Japan does have very strong protectionist measures for their auto industry to prevent foreign competition, which is how they maintained their auto industry, how they built it up to the point where they export. Because like initially post-World War II, like certainly the United States had the world auto industry. We were the producers of automobiles.
Think of Ford.
Yeah, Ford, Chevy. And Japan made the decision to put high tariffs on American import automobiles in order to protect and build up their own domestic automobile industry, and they were successful in doing that. Now, if you talk to free trade people who just talk comparative advantage, you would argue that that was very stupid for Japan. They'd say, no, you did not have a comparative advantage in automotive development, and Japan doesn't, frankly. if you want to talk like the setup, we have a much better access to natural resources than Japan. Like Japan really doesn't have the access to iron or any number of other natural resources which are part of that industrial development. Like, so they don't have the natural comparative advantage, right? And according to free trade, they should theoretically maximize what they can do very well, which, I don't know, I guess tuna fishing or something, like Japan being an island, great place for tuna. But Japan decided, actually, it's better for our economy if we have industrial production. So they took measures to make sure that they would have that industrial production, right? Whereas on our end, we said, comparative advantage, we'll beat everyone out. So you can import your stuff here, and then we'll try to export our stuff, but we can't export to Japan, we can't export to China, we can't export to Europe. Europe has a lot of protectionist tariffs against American automobiles. So like that's the thing is the American automotive industry, you may have noticed, it's declined a lot. Why? Because frankly, no one else is actually playing at free trade.
Wow. And that brings validity to President Trump's argument, saying that we're being taken advantage of.
I mean, that is his entire argument.
Yeah.
And economically, like when he's going into these trade wars, a lot of the time he's saying like either we're going to match what you are already doing to us until you either bring it down or like we're just going to ramp it up. Like that's what a lot of these has been more of a balancing of deficits in an effort to make domestic industry more competitive, right? Which there's certainly costs to what he's doing. You know, it is. I mean, he inherited a wrecked economy, and like the measures currently being taken, I think are long-term measures. They don't necessarily bear short-term fruit. So it is very unfortunate to go from an economy that has been tanked into taking measures which have long-term benefit but very painful consequences in the short term.
Yep.
You know?
The positive, at least the tax cuts were perpetuated, so that is going to help. So even though, so that way we don't have to give the government as much money anymore. Which they're just perpetuated, so that's a huge asset.
I mean, writing the original Trump tax cuts into law and continuing them was great. We need a lot more than that.
Yep.
But
and spending is a concern.
Spending is a concern.
Yeah.
Spending is a concern. You know, historically, for the longest time, we didn't have taxes. We had tariffs.
Interesting. So I remember under President John F. Kennedy, taxes were much higher.
Well, when I say historically, I'm going back to pre-World War I.
Yeah.
I'm going very far back. Here's the thing, like, income tax was initially instituted as a wartime measure. We didn't have income tax.
Yeah.
We went to war and we needed to fund the war. We got an income tax. And it was supposed to just be for the duration of the war, and then it was going to go away because income tax was in fact unconstitutional. And then we got amendments and we kept the income tax.
Yeah, that was argued in the Supreme Court. I remember even like before World War I, like we're talking the founding, within the first 50 years of the nation, that was argued at the Supreme Court level, was what's Congress's authority. Because the U.S. Constitution does grant the money purse to Congress.
Yes.
They're like, and by money purse meaning you have the authority to decide how much is given. You know, like 20 million here, 20 million there. The president doesn't have that authority, that's Congress. And then Congress, I believe there was an amendment that was added where it says that presented the tax. So like you're right, originally there wasn't tax, and that had to be argued and amended to the U.S. Constitution. Very interesting, that's right, yeah.
So, I mean, you could argue an increase in tariffs and a reduction in taxes is a return to form.
Wonderful, I think it's a great return to form. Yeah, because it's been reported, and not just by conservative media outlets, but even, if I remember correctly, CBS News, and even, I'm pretty sure CBS News reported that millions of jobs were lost from NAFTA.
Yeah.
Even the left-wing media, I understand there's some really great reporters at CBS News, but generally speaking, they're not on the biggest fans of on the right side of things. But they even know like millions of jobs just by NAFTA alone. And can you argue that because North American Free Trade Agreement, was Canada and Mexico violating the agreement by having high tariffs on us?
I'd have to read through the agreement to know. I think certainly it's in violation of the spirit of the agreement.
Yep. Yep.
Whether or not it's a violation of the legal document, the letter, I don't know enough to say. But I think it's very much a violation of the spirit of the agreement.
Yeah. And another idea, this just came to me now, is if you think about it, say worst case scenario, and correct me if I'm wrong, but worst case scenario in Korea is they become a satellite state of China like Tibet. And China runs Korea. So that's, hypothetically, that's what's worst case that could happen in Korea.
Yeah.
And right now, the Korean government, since they're not a satellite state to China, it's a lot better to negotiate with them with tariffs and things like that for the global economy. Where if China gets another satellite state, one, who says they're going to stop? Because Nazi Germany did not stop when they'd occupied the Rhineland in World War II. And even though they told Neville Chamberlain, we won't go past the Rhineland, it's going to be just fine, well, they didn't. And, well, similar here, one is, so just militarily and economically, China doesn't stop saying, okay, we'll just take Korea, we'll stop there. Yeah, right, you won't. History hasn't shown that. Secondly, imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a lot better to negotiate for global economy with the current Korean government than it is with the satellite state of China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly much easier to negotiate with an ally rather than a potential rival power.
And so this is another reason why Korea matters. Like say, worst case scenario, it happens, this time next year, Korea's a satellite state of China. One is, China, they get emboldened to then go after Taiwan, not to mention the chips, which by itself is a disaster, but then they just increase where it's like, who says they'll stop? And Vietnam and Thailand, they have favorable views of communism. But correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure they are communist governments in Thailand and Vietnam. I could be wrong on that.
I am not certain. I'm not the most well versed on Thailand and Vietnam, so I couldn't say.
Yeah.
I'd have to look into that. I mean, obviously, Vietnam War, we know there was communism there. What relation that has to the current Vietnamese regime, I'm not sufficiently versed to say.
That's right. And don't take my word as gospel either, so it's going to be confirmed. But hypothetically, though, it still runs where one is China can be emboldened to spread their influence, just like the Soviet Union did after World War II. And that means, talking about global economy and trade, that could have bad consequences to the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Plus allies, because we learned from World War II, to win a war, allies are necessary. And
I mean, expanding Chinese influence is very bad for Taiwan, for Japan, for Australia. That's one thing you don't necessarily think about in the conversation with China is Australia, but geographically, Australia is closer to China and them than it is to us. And certainly, if you look at like World War II as an example, when Japan was expanding, they did attempt to expand into Australia.
yeah, well, that touches it. Anything else you'd like to add regarding Korea?
Nothing really else with regards to Korea.
Wonderful.
So yeah, we've had a good discussion here. Thank you for having me. I have to hit those other topics some other time.
Yes, we will. Kirk, thank you. Not only for helping here, but being a great friend. You're amazing.
Anytime, Derek.
And
Thank you all for watching.
thank you for watching another episode of Eagle Productions Respect. Korea is an important issue. We just addressed it. And get ready, we have more episodes coming.